don't do anything stupid, and you won't get into trouble. That, I think, is probably the best illustrator of where China is in the Arctic right now.
Velkommen til Lørdagsuniversitetet Mini. Hos oss får du korte foredrag og samtaler med forskere fra UiT Norges Arktiske Universitet, rett på øret, når og hvor du måtte ønske. Mange tror Kina er på vei til å bli en politisk og økonomisk stormakt rundt Nordpolen. Tvert imot, sier førsteamanuensis Marc Lanteigne. Kina har et arktisk problem.
I want to keep this relatively informal and talk a little bit about China, where it fits in with my research, and more to the point, where China fits in the giant question of the Arctic. Now, I don't call myself fluent in Chinese. I haven't been tested. I'm probably somewhere in the B level. I'm not sure. But I'm hearkening back with my research now to when I was taking Mandarin lessons, and I had a very, very demanding professor who definitely was very critical about how you did your writing, because everything had to be very careful in terms of stroke order. And big surprise, one of the first words that we learned in Chinese was the word for China, Zhongguo. If my Lao Shu were here, she'd probably be criticizing this, but anyway. Literally translated Middle Kingdom, the center. And that kind of thinking has had the tendency to appear in China's foreign policy thinking in many different ways, including in the polar regions. When we talk about where China is now, we talk about how the Chinese government is defining where the country is going. It's never talk about, oh, we're becoming a great power, we're becoming a global power. It's about rejuvenation of the Chinese state. It's about restoration of what once was. Because China, for a very long time, was a center of the international system. Since the 17th, 18th centuries, for a variety of reasons, both internal decay and external colonialism, China lost that status. And one of the main cornerstones of policy under the current government of Xi Jinping is to bring it back. Now, how it's going to do that and whether it's going to succeed, that's another lecture. Where this is important, though, is China has been trying to demonstrate that we are a global power in the wings. And one of the important facets of that is to show that you are a player, not just in your home territory, not just in the Asia Pacific, which was the case, back about 20, 30 years ago, but you are a player in many different parts of the world, because China is now making the very difficult move from regional power to great power to global power. And we all know that is a very, very fraught process, and not every country has actually made it. So that has been an obsession of China for quite some time. It's been definitely a major area of its foreign policy thinking. Where do the polar regions come in? Well, for the last few years, there have been a lot of policy papers coming out of Beijing, including the most recent 5-year plan, which identify the polar regions as, and I'm quoting, new strategic frontier, along with outer space, along with the ocean floor, along with cyberspace. So it is very apparent that China does see both the Arctic and Antarctica as important for its future great power policies. The problem, though, and this is where I start to get into a few debates with some of my fellow China scholars. Back before I was working in Tromsø, I was down in New Zealand, that famous Arctic state I was telling you about. And I was doing a lot of work on Antarctica. And even though New Zealand is a very small state, a very quiet state, you will not worry about finding China hawks in New Zealand. Those who say that China is going to be a big danger to the international order, we should all prepare now, Mayday. But so I would get into quite a few debates about this. Where I counter a lot of this discussion about whether China is going to be a revisionist player in the Arctic, the Antarctic, is that this is a country that is still very new to the region. And we just saw evidence of that a few hours ago. We saw the Yellow River Station. I was up at the front steps. There didn't seem to be anyone home. I didn't ring the bell, but I didn't want to press my luck. But apparently, there hasn't been anyone in the building for at least since the beginning of COVID. And I was told by a few people that Chinese researchers don't usually tend to mingle with the rest of the community in the Ålesund. This doesn't surprise me, to be honest, Because whenever China enters into a new region that it doesn't have a lot of background information on, it tends to behave very, very conservatively. It tends to kind of hang back. I'm here with my notebook. I want to figure out what everyone else is thinking. And then maybe later on down the line, I'll come up with a policy and start kind of integrating more. Like way back during my graduate study, well, not way back, but during my graduate studies, I had the same kind of responses when I was looking at China's participation in the Asia Pacific, like various economic cooperation initiatives. You would have Chinese officials come in, sit at the back with the notebook, and say nothing for the first few years of the meetings. So China's a newcomer in the Arctic. I mean, that has to be taken into account, even compared to some of the other major non-Arctic states, Italy, Poland, Netherlands, Britain, France. China's had a very tiny amount of time to really get to know the region. Antarctica, China only had a serious presence since the early 80s. In the Arctic, I would say seriously for the past 20 years. The Yellow River Station was only fully operational in 2004. That's a very tiny amount of time to get the necessary experience. And that's the other point that gets lost in this debate about whether China's a threat to the Arctic. You can't buy experience. China may have a really big economy, second biggest in the world. It may have a great deal of financial resources that it is splashing around as part of the Belt and Road initiatives. But you can't buy experience. And the other problem is you can't buy data. You can't buy needed information about what is happening in this part of the world. You need to, again, go in with your notebook, take the amount of hours, get the experience. Only then can you really come up with very good information. And we're seeing a lot of examples of China entering the Arctic, not getting the facts right, having to retrench and having to rethink its approach. And we're seeing the results of this right now. So when we talk about China in the Arctic, I'm certainly not saying that there is nothing there and that this is not something we should be concerned about. We're seeing a lot of examples from many different facets. But there are also some myths about China in the Arctic, or to use the American expression, dogs that didn't bark. Things that were considered to be absolutely true, but turned out to be not so. The first is that China has a grand plan for the Arctic. I have heard that so many times about China's plan for the Arctic. There isn't one. Or rather, a lot of this planning is being done piece by piece by piece. In many cases, having to deal with conditions as they come. Because China is a newcomer, because China very often is extremely dependent on Arctic states, not just Russia, but Norway, the United States, Canada. China needs to get its data from somewhere and is therefore very much dependent on the goodwill of these other Arctic countries. And yet we are seeing the narrative, and this really came to a crescendo at the Arctic Circle conference back in October, where we had this little contretemps between a NATO admiral and China's ambassador to Iceland. The admiral basically saying that China is just as much of a threat to the Arctic as Russia, because it has economic ambitions. It calls itself a near-Arctic state, which I'll get back to in a moment, and that it doesn't share our values. That is a quote, doesn't share our values. And that leads to a whole question about, well, what values are we talking about here? But I'll hold that for now. So where is the idea that China has a grand plan and that it's not a very good plan? Where is it coming from? To be fair, some of this has been coming from Beijing itself. Some of the terminology that the Chinese government has used to describe the Arctic has been a little bit open to interpretation. First of these, back about 12 years ago now, a People's Liberation Army admiral, Yin Zhuo, and I got to say, PLA admirals have a very long history of mouthing off when they shouldn't. Like I could name a few examples of, including one that suggested that, if you try to take Taipei, we'll take out Los Angeles. He had to be walked back on that particular statement. This is back in the 90s. So Yin Zhuo, when he was talking about the Arctic, he called it the common heritage of mankind. That was the first indication, again, 12 odd years ago, that, oh no, China's about to walk into the Arctic, grab everything, challenge the Arctic Council, everybody run. Tiny problem is that the quote was taken out of context. We go back to the original report, he was referring specifically to the donut hole, specifically to the area outside of various exclusive economic zones. yes, we could debate, okay, is it really common heritage? We can define the term, but this was basically taken out of context, but used even now as proof that China has revisionist plans for the region. The second one, and I even have friends in Shanghai who said we never should have used this term. Jin Beiji Guojia, near Arctic state. This has been twisted into a pretzel so many times, been taken as a smoking gun, especially by the Trump government, that yes, China is trying to create an Arctic identity where none exists. And here's our proof. A little bit of a problem, though. First of all, there's the persistent myth that this actually came out of the Chinese government. The term near Arctic state came from the Chinese government. That's completely incorrect. It had been bounced around in Chinese academia at least as far back as 2010. If you go back and do a document survey, an article survey, discourse analysis, you will see back around that time, so 12, 13 years ago, that China was looking at what was happening in the Arctic and it was getting very worried about where things were going. This was the time where we had articles by, I think it was Scott Bergerson, talking about this mad scramble for resources in the region. There was the Lusat Declaration that was starting to come out. Like, China was very worried that the Arctic was about to be cut up into 8 pieces and everybody else too bad. You get nothing. And Beijing was arguing that, look, because we are a very large economy, because we have very specific interests in many parts of the world, like any great power does, no, we are not going to be shut out. We are not challenging anything. We're not going against international law or the Arctic Council, but we don't want to be kicked out either. So near Arctic state, yes, there's a bit of geography there, although we're talking about 1,400 kilometers. But there's also so much evidence that has been produced linking the Arctic with other parts of the world to climate change in China, to different pollution conditions. And that reflected right what I said at the beginning, that China needs information. It needs data. So we're not an Arctic state, but we are a near Arctic state. We are close enough. And I would point out that when the UK put out its first white paper, I think it was 2014, right at the beginning, we are the Arctic's closest neighbor. And all my Chinese friends threw up their hands and said, great, they can do it. Why can't we? And then, of course, Estonia comes out and says we are the nearest state to the Arctic. We're Arctic adjacent. So China's not the only one who's done this. Now, the problem, though, is this has been interpreted as, still gets interpreted today as the smoking gun, the idea that China wants to change the rules, change the conditions. Mike Pompeo, then Secretary of State, in his now extremely infamous speech at Rovaniemi, the Arctic Council SAO, went right out of his way to say that there are Arctic states, non-Arctic states, and there are no third category. Direct smack at Beijing. In addition to being a very bad speech, in my humble opinion, that was like a screaming red light to the Chinese government that, guess what, we are not going to play fair here. And I think in the end, it probably cost more than it actually gained. The third expression that is very often used to suggest a grand plan on China's part came from a speech by Xi Jinping about a decade ago in Tasmania, of all places, where he referred to the country as a polar great power. My friends in New Zealand just went crackers at that. Again, they were saying, aha, smoking gun, etc. That China wants to push itself into both the Arctic and Antarctica. Tiny problem, though. The word for power, the word that he used, I mean, there are different words that you can use in Chinese, jiang. Like the English word power, it can mean might, it can mean strength, but it could also mean ability, capability. Many Chinese policy speeches, they choose their words very, very carefully. Like, it's been really interesting looking at policy speeches, the Chinese version versus the English translation. We're seeing a lot of divergence between the two. Used to be that, they were relatively similar, but just over the past decade, we've really been seeing a lot of creative interpretation once you get the English version. So was Xi trying to play to the local audience in China to say that, yes, we're going to be a mighty polar power while maintaining a little bit of ambiguity? I think that's the case. Because the fact is, China cannot wander into the Arctic, say, I don't believe in the Arctic Council, I don't care about international law, law of the sea, don't care. It can't do it. It just does not have the ability to do it. It is dependent on the goodwill of not only Russia, but pretty much the entire Arctic structure in order to get anywhere. So when we talk about grand plans, yeah, China put out a white paper in 2018. It's the first and so far only policy document which explains what China wants in the Arctic. And again, it's been brought forward as yet another smoking gun. It's like, aha, here's China wanting to be revisionist. Reading the paper, though, you see a very conservative document. No reference to security, other than search and rescue and civilian safety. Massive amount of space about the need to learn about the Arctic, the need to understand the Arctic, to participate in the governance of the region. It is a very tame paper, even compared to some papers that have come out from Japan and Germany recently. So we talk about grand plans now. We still have not seen any indication that we have a single approach to the Arctic. We're still seeing very kind of piece by piece approaches here now. So that's the first myth. The second, the Belt and Road now has a northern component. It's had a northern component. It was actually a Russian initiative. China picked it up and ran with it. The Polar Silk Road, or Ice Silk Road if you want to take the Chinese version. Admiral Bauer at the Arctic Circle, he pointed to that as a sign that, yep, China has nefarious plans in the Arctic because it wants to create debt traps. It wants to ensnare Norway and various other Arctic states in these horrible debts that China likes to sow everywhere. This is another dog that didn't hunt. You look at the state of the Polar Silk Road right now. China had very ambitious plans back in 2017-18. Every single Arctic state was going to be the beneficiary of Chinese investment. There was going to be a gold mine in Nunavut. There was going to be a massive port in eastern Iceland. There were going to be mines all over Greenland. I'll get back to that in a moment. There was going to be, so close and yet so far, a train station in Tromsø. I could finally hop on a train, go down to Buda, go down to Oslo. And even some suggestion that we would have a train link between Kirkenes, Rovaniemi, which would hook onto the Trans-Siberian Railway. I could be in Beijing in a few days. Never mind going through Gardermoen. None of this has happened. Exactly none. Either because in some cases they simply weren't cost effective. In other cases, they ran into a great deal of political opposition. In other cases, it was just, well, this is a nice idea, but it won't work in practice. You look at this Polar Silk Road now. Which areas has China actually invested in the Arctic? If you take out Russia, there's not much there. There's a bridge that was built by Chinese labor. It's outside of, was it Harstad? Narvik, okay. Apparently it's already having construction problems. It needs to be rebuilt, or at least reconstructed. So that's the sum total of the Polar Silk Road in Norway that we can actually point to. And even in Russia right now, yes, China has invested quite a bit in the Yamal liquefied natural gas project, all kinds of discussions about various other energy networks. But even at that, there were big plans for a massive port facility at Arkhangelsk and a railway connected to it back in Amur. None of that is going to happen, according to people I've spoken to. And even these natural gas projects have started to slow down because many Chinese firms are, quite frankly, very nervous about getting hit with the same sanctions that Russia is currently experiencing. You'll notice that the number of Chinese vessels, cargo vessels, that have gone through the Northern Sea Route as part of the Polar Silk Road, zippo, nul. Why? Because COSCO, and they were very upfront about this, we do not want to take the risk. We cannot afford to get hit with Western sanctions. So the Polar Silk Road really has not produced much in the way of tangibles. Even within Russia, the results are spotty at best. Now let's talk about Greenland for just a quick moment. Go back about close to 10 years now. Ink was being spilled about China's massive investments in Greenland. That Greenland was going to be the center of Chinese mining initiatives. That the mine in Kuannersuit, around just in southern Greenland, was going to be a major source of Chinese investment, producing uranium, rare earths. That China would eventually dominate the Greenlandic economy. nothing has happened. There's one mining project which may still go forward, and that's the Tronen Fjord. And even that one's starting to look a bit shaky because the U.S. is promising counter-investment. And the U.S. and Denmark have made it very clear that they do not want China to get an economic foothold there, especially if Greenland is going to become independent at some point. The Greenland government is very happy to trade with China, the U.S., European Union, whoever is interested. But Denmark has been also very quick to kind of securitize something, to say, hey, this is a security issue whenever China gets too close to an investment. So that's the second myth. The Polar Silk Road simply is not there at the moment. And I don't know at this point when we'll get to the stage where China will start engaging in major cargo runs again. Will we start to see more Chinese cargo vessels come through here? Now, that said, it is going to be very likely that China will want to pick up Arctic shipping again, especially when the Central Arctic becomes available. But we are dealing with a long time frame here before China is able to do that effectively. The third myth, very quickly. So much discussion now about China and Russia in the Arctic. And the dog that is not barking right now, and I don't see it barking in the future, is that a Sino-Russian partnership in the Arctic is inevitable. The two of them are eventually going to be pushed together. They're going to become Arctic allies and do whatever is necessary to counter the West. Well, I've already spoken about holes in Sino-Russian economic cooperation. I would also say that with Russia's particular take on Arctic policy, while Chinese money is welcome, while Chinese investment is certainly great because Russia simply can't get investment from Europe or many other places right now, even when China became an observer in the Arctic Council in 2013, Russian officials were quick to run in front of a microphone and say, yes, this is great, but please bear in mind we are the Arctic state. I'm a skeptic when it comes to China-Russia cooperation. There have been calls, there have been suggestions that there's going to be an alliance between the two countries since, at least the 90s, back when I was listening to Stone Temple Pilots and drinking Fruitopia. And none of this has actually come to pass. It is important to remember, first of all, these two countries fought a war not too long ago. Second of all, you look at the situation on the Sino-Russian border. A colleague of mine and I co-wrote a piece for the Arctic Yearbook about internal colonialism within Russia, including Chinese migration, which is a very touchy subject in Siberia and the Russian Far East. That hasn't gone away. Is the amount of trust between these two countries strong enough to create some kind of bilateral Arctic agenda? We are not seeing that now. We are seeing, yes, calls for greater Arctic cooperation, calls for more scientific discussion, possibly cooperation in areas of research bases here in Svalbard. But how deep is that going to go? And how are we going to be dealing with trust between one country that is still rising as a power, maybe not as quick as before, but still is, and Russia, which, to put it politely, has a very, very unclear future? There's a quote that kept sticking in my mind when I was researching this area from the First World War. It was attributed to several different Imperial German generals, possibly Erich von Moltke, expressing frustration at Germany's major ally, Austria-Hungary. We are shackled to a corpse. And talking to Chinese officials, and this is obviously before the Ukraine invasion, you got that kind of mindset. That China does not want to hitch its entire Arctic agenda to a country which may be a corpse politically in a very short time. So what is China looking at in regards to Russia now? Well, officially, China has declared neutrality in the Ukraine conflict. Colleague of ours from Ukraine currently in Tromsø, he uses much more flowery language to describe the neutrality project. I will not use this in polite company, but this is neutrality that we've never seen before. It's almost like, those jugglers that spin plates and they're running around trying to keep the plates going all at the same time. That is China's neutrality policy right now. It is desperately trying to maintain good relations with Russia while not cutting off the rest of the Arctic. And quite frankly, it is not doing very well. You look at the relation now between China and Canada, China and Sweden, China and Denmark. Even China and Norway, things are a little bit fuzzy right now. Beijing has not been able to maintain very good relations with several key Arctic cities, let alone China and the United States. That's a whole other issue right there. So a lot of the goodwill that China had been trying to build up in the Arctic is either gone or very heavily damaged. And so Beijing is going to have a choice to make now when it comes to the Arctic. Do we give up and simply attach ourselves to Russia, despite its very ambiguous future? Or do we continue to try to engage the other Arctic states? So far, the Chinese government is choosing option 2. It is trying to jumpstart relations with at least some of the Nordic region. There was a high-level visit in Norway not too long ago. But the fact is, with the situation now in the Arctic with the Arctic Council being ambiguous, China now has even less room to maneuver when it comes to Arctic diplomacy than it had before. Like a colleague of mine at the department, he argued right after the invasion began, well, great, we just threw open the door in the Arctic to China. They're just going to walk in, give Russia terms, and they'll be able to maintain a strong relationship in the region. If anything, the opposite has happened. China's doors to the Arctic have become closed now, even more so than before. So those are the 3 myths. So to conclude, how do we describe China in the Arctic then? China wants to be a norm entrepreneur in the Arctic. Now, what does that mean? China cannot walk into the region and say, this is how things are going to be. This is how international law is going to be. But they also can't simply hang back and wait for the Arctic states to do whatever is necessary. They're trying to find a middle way. So a norm entrepreneur says, well, this is a method of conduct or a method of behavior. I think this is a good idea. We should try it. It's good. Here, let me demonstrate it. Now, usually it's small or medium states that are very good at being a norm entrepreneur. Norway has been very good at putting forward ideas about international conduct and having it stick. Great powers, it's a little bit trickier. But China has been trying to sell the norm to anybody who will listen that even though the Arctic is very demarcated, we have our international law, we have our law of the sea. China has been an enthusiastic supporter of the Polar Code, the Central Arctic fishing ban. China's really going out of its way to avoid being labeled a spoiler. But China is trying to sell the idea of the Arctic as international space, that there is a lot of room, maybe not in negotiating halls, but in the outside hallways, to talk about our interests. What I'm asking myself, especially under current circumstances, is China going to be happy, whichever way the Arctic Council goes, sitting up in the bleachers with Italy and Switzerland, not having a vote on Arctic affairs, especially as it continues to engage the region? My argument is no, in which case we have a little bit of a problem. We either reform the Arctic Council, which I think is going to be a little important, or something else needs to be done, or, less good, China will simply go out on its own. For now, though, China is taking a very conservative stance in the region. To end where I began, when I was going through my Mandarin lessons, we learned quite a bit of slang in one of the classes. And the favorite that I still use in a lot of my presentations, no zuo no die. That means don't do anything stupid and you won't get into trouble. That, I think, is probably the best illustrator of where China is in the Arctic right now. Thank you.